One of the difficulties corporations face when going global is the divergence between the organization's own standards and reality on the ground. Even the most comprehensive code of ethics, to cite just one example, will be useless if it clashes with local culture. At the same time, local cultures cannot be the main sources of corporate standards. This would rip any organization apart. Bunmi Banjo from Google Africa explains how Google succeeds in squaring this circle.
Hi everyone, good afternoon. Thanks for having me. It's been an exciting about 12 hours or so that I've been here. I'm going to talk today about my perspective on the topic. It's very simple. I'm going to be talking a lot from my own experiences, and hopefully you guys will be able to take something away from what I'm sharing. I've happened to live and work in a lot of countries. So I grew up in Canada, I worked in Canada, my first jobs were in Canada, and then I worked in the UK, I've worked in the US, I've lived and worked in India, and I currently live and work in Nigeria. I cover, so far I think I've touched about 29 countries or so in Africa. So it's been, 20 so years of being in different places that are with different types of people, different work environments. But one thing that I've seen across all of these places is, at the end of the day, I think the approach is always very similar, and the earlier conversations touched on that. Openness is always key, and being, open to learning from the other, and not being afraid to see differences, but recognizing them just as differences, not necessarily better or worse, just different. And so some of the things I'll share with you today are about how Sub-Saharan Africa, what I might call often SSA, is a little bit different from what you might be used to. So the first thing is, I think that was touched on earlier, it's a very, very complex region. And I think that's one thing that a lot of companies that find themselves working in Africa really have to deal with, is they come in with this mindset that we're just going to Africa and want to figure out how to work in Ghana, then we've conquered the continent. And it usually doesn't work that way. So on the good news side, there's a lot of growth in Africa. Some of the fastest growing countries in the world are on the continent. So Ethiopia is the fastest growing country this year at 8.3%. Tanzania is in the top 10 as well, and so is Djibouti. So we have a lot of growth, economic growth. Obviously, we're all, generally speaking, coming from a lower base, but that growth is attractive to a lot of organizations kind of rushing in. And it's easy to look at the chart and say, oh, Ethiopia is the fastest growing country in Africa. I'm running there to do business, but then, of course, there's a lot of realities on the ground that you have to deal with. So yeah, one of the challenges is the fact that population is rising faster than I think any of our governments are ready to address. So we have a lot of young people coming into the workforce without much to do. And that's one of the things, reason why we focus on digital skills, so that young people can actually start their own businesses and not only create employment for themselves, but also hire people. And so that's, for me, one of the big opportunities for people that are thinking of doing business in Africa, is how do you leverage the energy and the creativity of young people to actually create value for, your organization, but also for themselves and their communities. And I think that takes, some creative thinking. It takes a lot of openness to doing business a little bit differently with them, but also just making sure that the goal kind of focuses on channeling that energy. The concept of community is very important across our cultures. So we're more and more becoming more individualistic. We're seeing that more, especially with young people kind of being connected to the rest of the world. But at the core, for even the young people, being accepted in society is really important. Doing kind of what we do as a society or as a culture is really important. So thinking of that concept of community is always kind of, you're almost there when you're having a conversation with someone and you're realizing that you're not just talking to this person, you're talking to them and anybody else that is within the immediate group. So, for example, in South Africa, there's a concept of Ubuntu. Ubuntu means I exist because we all exist, essentially. So without the group, I'm not really anything. And a lot of people believe that. And so when you're having a conversation with someone and you think they might be the decision maker in a business sense, a lot of times they may not actually commit to anything until they've gotten the okay of the immediate community, whatever that community is that is important to them. So it's important to understand that. That oftentimes will mean extended family members, depending on the kind of conversation you're having. Sometimes it's just the work group, for example, and sometimes it's even larger. So if you're talking to people that are a member of an association, for example, they may not commit to anything until the entire association is comfortable with that idea. So when you're selling something to someone in Africa, you want to be selling, you want to be making a case that is useful for an entire community, not just that individual. Another concept that I think is important is hierarchy. So I work for an American company that's, been in Africa for a while. I've been in my job for close to 6 years. And the company culture is very flat. The organization is a flat organization. I can walk to, anyone at any level and have a conversation. Now, in most parts of Africa, that's not usually the case. There's usually the boss, right? And beside the boss, there's like the different levels of bosses that follow. So these concepts are really important to people. And the way you kind of marry that is I don't think you need to change how your organization works, but having that understanding means you think about roles and responsibilities and making it clear to people you're doing business with who's making decisions, for example. Because saying we all kind of, we're all in a democracy and we all kind of figure it out together doesn't usually work. The next point is so as a society or as an organization, you have your own values. And I think as the professor mentioned earlier, there's a temptation to think your values are kind of the way the world should work. But the reality is often different in many places, right? So in many countries in Africa, for example, homosexuality is against the law. It means people actually go to prison if they're suspected of being homosexual, right? So this is something that we grapple with as an organization. An example here, during the Sochi Olympics, Google had a global doodle that was essentially celebrating homosexuality. So it's a company where we're open and we obviously accept everyone. But in Nigeria, it's not something we talk about much, right? Because you want employees that may or may not be gay to feel like they're protected, right? Because if it's against the law, then they essentially get in trouble for being open. And so just being aware that there are situations where what you believe and how you do things is not always aligned with kind of how things work in that place. And, we have our own perspectives and what we hope would happen, but the reality is kind of what the reality is, and just realizing that we need to work within that context. A couple things that I thought it would be important to just keep in mind and consider as we think more about globalization and working kind of cross-culturally. So virtual work is obviously becoming more and more predominant. I mean, there's a lot of people here that will do business in Africa without actually physically meeting some of the people they will do business with. While that has its benefits, obviously there are efficiencies there. To me, the most important thing is to recognize that you can't successfully do business without building trust. And it's very difficult to build trust via Skype. I think meeting the people, feeling the soil, being on ground is critical. The other thing is, and I think we kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, is just keeping in mind just being a good human being. So ethical principles are critical. So, and I think it's just constantly being aware of the fact that people are people, humans are humans, regardless of how much they have in their bank account, and coming at people with that level of respect and regard. And not just the individuals, but also society. So we have a lot of examples, obviously, of things around pollution and things like that across Africa where companies do things that they can't do in other parts of the world, right? So again, same approach. If you won't do it in another part of the world because you'll get in trouble, why do it in Africa? And I'll end on this note. I think back to what I alluded to earlier, I haven't had to change. I haven't had to change much working in India or working in the US or now across the region. I think, just understanding what your goals are as an individual, as an organization, being very clear on what the goals are, and then practicing, to me, what the three most important things is. One, being humble enough to understand that you don't have all the answers, humble enough to understand that your way, even though it works for you or has worked for centuries, can be different from someone else's way. So that humility, I think, is important, and people sense that. A lot of times you see people come tell you, well, why do you guys do things this way? It's not efficient for you, right? There's a reason why it's done a certain way in other places. And just having the humility to be open to understand what might be driving that, I think, is important. The other thing is just simple humanity, right? Kind of touched on that already. Just seeing the people you're dealing with on ground as your equals. And finally, just honesty, being honest about what your goals are. One thing I've seen a lot is, no matter what it is that your goal is, if you're honest about it, people will help you to get there. So being honest enough to earn their trust and maintain it is important. And that's it for me. I hope that was helpful.